Hello and welcome to the Game Dev Local podcast, a collection of amazing people who love everything about the making of games and are an inspired community who love to share and create insight. Now, I'm on a Podquest. My Podquest is to learn everything you wanted to know about game dev but never dared to ask. And I am delighted that I'm joined today by designer Nina Kim. Nina, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Hello, I'm Nina. I'm currently a senior designer at Rare, but I started my whole game dev journey as a customer support representative. Then I went to community moderating, I went into QA, and then I trained in production, and now I'm a designer.
And this is a fairly classic path in. So I want to get into the detail of that. So for those who don't know, as I say, I'm Oscar Clark. I've been around in the industry since 1998. Yes, I know that's scary. I've always had fairly commercial roles. Typically, I've been a product owner. And it actually took me about 10 years to actually accept I was a designer. I was always designing games, but I was doing it as an amateur since the 90s. I was basically going to board game conventions, tabletop conventions that existed in that era. And I was showing off my work and trying to pitch it and various other things. And there was no money at that time in board games. So I found an opportunity. British Telecom were looking for somebody to run a thing called Wireplay. They had a marketing job. I was trained as a marketeer. And as I've gone on my career, I've worked out just how intimately connected the knowledge of the sort of, I think the applied psychology, the kind of language that I tend to use that goes with marketing, but also with the fundamentals of product development. And so let's talk about kind of let's take a step back from that, but that's the context I want to explore. I mean, we've had this conversation separately where you say to me, oh, I don't have as much experience, but you've been doing this for over 10 years. You've worked in customer support, you've worked in QA, you've done design work, you've worked for multiple companies. What is it that do you think about the roles that we do that makes us not necessarily have that kind of confidence to say, this is what I am?
Yeah, I just think that there's so many different aspects of design. So, like, there's many different types of design. First off, like, you could be a level designer, you could be a systems designer, and usually, like, I was put in like a generalist role, and then it's sort of like feels like you're floundering in some aspects. It's like, okay, well, I have to figure out this part of design, and that's different across every genre of game, even within genres. Like, just depending on the type, like the project and the specifics of what you're trying to accomplish with your game, the design could be completely different. So it kind of feels like you're always challenged. Yeah.
No, exactly. But that's kind of the joy of it as well. And I do think there's a lot of issues here. I think as an industry, we are we're very slow at getting a definition. We kind of think we're special. We are, yeah, we're different, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't have some way of defining some of this stuff a bit better. You kind of hinted at some of those things. So, when you think about level design, the specific elements that go into certain types of game, particularly obviously platform games, but not just limited to platform, about the idea of a kind of progression framed structure where we have a certain amount of information to convey. We may have some narrative art that we're forming some component of. We might have some game in mechanic elements that we're trying to implement or to twist. So each kind of section of that you could take in isolation, and a lot of larger teams obviously do. But what happens when you have the difference between the position in the environment art versus the game mechanic versus the economy of the game versus the player retention strategy versus the narrative arc? I mean, are we breaking these things up for good reason, or are they actually genuinely a spectrum of skills?
I believe there are a spectrum of skills, and a lot of designers that I've talked to, they kind of come from backgrounds that are really mixed, like production, art, and then engineering, and then they become a designer off of those things, and all of those skills help with designing. It's kind of like acting as a glue. And that's why like the position, like the actual discipline is so hard to define, is because it's
Mm.
like a lot of consideration of everything that goes in and kind of like forming that.
And also particularly I think because it's very rare that a designer actually gets to come up with the principle of the game, the concept of the game. I mean, we're typically involved in much lower level detail, or we're brought in. So my kind of design work is commercial strategic design. I'm typically brought in because the game's not retaining, the game's not monetizing, the game's broken in some way, and somebody needs to try and work out why. And so my kind of design is very data led. It's very much about understanding, oh, this is where they're dropping off. Okay, why could that be? Whereas if you're starting with no premise, or other, here is the world. We're making a sandbox game. It's going to have this theme. It's going to have this structure. Somebody is going to be working out what the core interactions are, and that'll be a designer role. Someone's going to work out where you do those things again. But I do wonder, if we go back to basics, you mentioned there, a lot of people come from lots of different disciplines. Now, one of the things I'm a little bit kind of maybe nervous is the right way. I think historically, at least, the training processes that we've done for designer roles have not been really up to, no, I don't want to say up to standard, because no, people didn't know better. Maybe we didn't define it well enough, maybe. So I'm not blaming anyone in particular, but I feel like that when I've looked at the materials or the structure of courses historically, I found that they didn't focus only on design questions. They didn't talk about mechanics. They didn't talk about engagement. They didn't talk about economies. And I don't mean monetization by economies. I mean the resource components part of that. So instead, they often had like a third of the course on game art, art creation, or a third of the course on programming. And I get that these things are useful. You mentioned it yourself. These things are useful. The breadth of knowledge is useful. But do you think are we equipping people with knowing what to do, what design means?
I think there's a huge part that's missing. Like
Mm.
when I first started as a designer, there was a lot of Excel work, and that's definitely
Mm.
something that could be taught in schools, but I didn't personally get that. And
No.
so a lot of the stuff that I learned was on the job, especially like designing with data in mind as well. Like that's not going to be applicable to everyone because
No.
but in like live service games it's useful, and any game that's free to play. And so like these sorts of things can definitely be taught, but
But I think that the kind of spreadsheet function isn't limited to live ops or free to
right.
play. I mean, I've seen it so many places in so many different ways. Even because at the end of the day, someone's got to work out. You have a series of inputs, you have a series of outputs. You're going to have some sort of scarcity. You're going to have some sort of surplus. How do you make sure that you know that the amount that's coming in from certain sources goes? Again, I know I'm talking about economy balance here, but I ended up doing a lot of that stuff merely because, as a product owner, I had to do all the spreadsheets to work out whether the game would make any money. So I got to be relatively good at using spreadsheets, and therefore, when I was trying to solve a problem, I ended up modeling it as a spreadsheet. But when I saw other designers were doing it themselves, then that's kind of what I didn't think I was a designer, partly because of that sense of, no, you're not going to use a spreadsheet for this, are you? And they do. I mean, am I making any sense?
Absolutely.
Mm.
It's a very funny thing that I found when coming from being a student to becoming a designer. I was like, oh, all of design is using the spreadsheet. Like, why didn't we learn this as students? And also,
Yeah.
like, people just don't know. They're like, I want to be a designer. What should I study? What should I look into? And they usually
Study
jump to,
Excel.
yeah, yeah. It's a really strange thing to suggest, but yeah. Yeah.
But honestly, I think there's something, again, so there's some really advanced techniques which I don't even know how to use, which I think at some point I have some time to do it, but things like Monte Carlo simulations. Now, I mean, obviously all it is a probabilistic mechanism. It's built into tools like Excel. And if you are dealing with a situation where you're doing a level, and in that level there are certain things where have certain amount of outcomes, for example, what percentage of players find that particular loot box? By the way, I don't mean commercial loot, but I just mean a thing that pays something out for the player in game. That. How many people find that bit of information? How many people get that amount of experience points? How many times does it take them to go through the level? How many times do they fail? Do they manage to keep anything? All these things are percentages. I'm a bit of a fan of tools like machinations as well. Again, another tool that I need to spend more time learning. And yes, I have an affiliate code. But the point being that this is, I think, really an interesting area where choosing different ways to model is as important as fundamental game mechanics. And where I'm going with that is things like, I'm going to show things like this. Massively interesting. So this is a book by Jeff Engelstein and a guy called Isaac Shalev from CRC Press. Basically, it's a literal encyclopedia of board game mechanics, and I love this stuff. And this is my bias. I don't know about you. Did you ever do any board game design?
Not personally. I mean, dabbled, but not professionally.
No, but that's fine. I mean, I didn't do it professionally. I dabbled. I sold 200 copies of my role-playing game, and about 10 copies of a board game I made. It doesn't really count.
I don't think that's dabbling.
It's dabbling. Honestly, it's dabbling. But there's something about, and I still play with this stuff. When I get the chance, it's my true love, which is sitting down and trying to do a paper prototype of a board game. And I think that I couldn't do any of the other stuff without that principle. So I'll talk about like spreadsheets, machinations, whatever, Monte Carlo, but at the end of the day, the building blocks of design are an interaction, some sort of like perspective on that visually or narratively, and some sort of challenge associated with that interaction, and some reward that comes at the end of it. And I think at the very basic level, most people know about loops who do design, but I think they often end up not thinking about the consequences of those loops and the follow-up of that. Again, like I say, I can talk about this stuff forever. How do you look at design problems? Is there kind of like a way that you kind of, I mean, as I'm saying, I'll use spreadsheets, I'll use board game techniques, I've played hundreds of thousands of games, probably, if I counted it all up, and I don't remember any game source of any mechanic. I don't have a brain that does that, but I can remember the mechanics, if that makes sense. So that's kind of the pool I will play with. How do you kind of like look at a game design challenge problem?
It's so funny because I've talked to people about this and everyone has a different method. Mine is I wouldn't say mine isn't as systematic. It's sort of like looking at what type of game we're making, who we're making it for, and then what type of feeling I want them to feel. And that's not just emotions. It's sort of like things that are tactile, like the progress to that moment, everything building up to that. So it's mostly like when it comes to mechanics and system, it's basically the feeling. It's sort of like...
But that's exactly true, though, isn't it? I mean, so I've effectively dived in at like 500 miles an hour, and what you've done is you've taken us right back to the principle. In fact, I've probably said this on the podcast before, but one of the things that I learned on my first day of marketing, my course of marketing, was identify and satisfy consumer needs. Now, that's exactly what you've just described, because if we don't know what we're trying to, who we are trying to make a game for, what they're expecting from the game, how we want them to feel emotionally, tactily, logically, psychologically, we can't make a game. We're back to the applied psychology, aren't we?
Yeah, it's funny because I mean, it's still. I was gonna say some people go into it and they're like, "I'm making this game the way I think is fun," and it's for them basically.
Mm.
I think a lot of challenges with like junior designers, they're like, "I'm making this game and this is how I would play it," and then they can't think of other
Mm.
perspectives. But really, they're making a game for someone like them, so it
Yeah,
still kind of applies. Yeah.
it does. But I mean, but there is the rub, isn't it? Because as you say, if you don't have an array of perspective, you're going to make a game which is your interpretation of something that already exists. And that is it. I think that's where a lot of games fall down because you don't step out of your shell, out of your perspective, your point of view. If somebody else experienced, I don't know, a Zelda game differently than you did, the game you're making doesn't meet their expectation. I think with Scott Rogers, there's a book called Level Up by a guy called Scott Rogers, one of my kind of go-to design books. He talks about the triangle of weird. Now, it's not quite the same analogy, but I think there's a connection. And in the triangle of weird, you can change one thing. You can change the world, the characters, or the interactions. I may have messed up the language he uses, but that's basically the idea. Now, if your interpretation of the world is different than the rest of the audience, if your interpretation of the rules, the interaction is different, or the characters are different, then you changing anything else, you don't know what because it just feels too loose, too distant, too different from what I want to do. That cognitive dissonance of how I play is too great. And I think that's kind of where I struggle when I'm trying to help people who are, maybe haven't yet hit that point where they can see the different player point of view, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It's why I mean this isn't a solve for that, but it's why I encourage a lot of people who are in design to play many different games,
Mm.
experience many different things outside of games as well. Because the more you, for instance, moving to the UK, I learned
Mm.
what it's like culturally over here
Yeah,
that I wouldn't have. Discovered if I hadn't lived over here. And so that
yeah.
opened up a whole different perspective that I could cater to. And that's applicable to games because there's different markets. Asian market is different than American market and
Yeah.
so on.
Although I would still argue, because you were Seattle based, weren't you? I think.
Yes, yes.
I think if there's any place in the US that's most closely aligned to the UK, I would suspect it's Seattle. I'm a bit of a fanboy of Seattle, as it happens. But I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's like some travel is fantastic for the mind, and yes, we can travel through books as well, and films, and so on and so forth. Cultural engagement matters. Finding different ways that people tell stories matters. And like I say, I would always suggest playing as many board games as possible. I won't show my camera around the room, but this room, I am in danger of imminent death by board games. The number of Kickstarter board games I have purchased that I have never played, but I have read all the rules, is ridiculous, utterly ridiculous.
I am the same.
But this is the joy. We got to again. I think this is one of the things where I don't know many people who are good at design who don't relish the things they design. I think I'm at loath to say passion is necessary because I think that can get misinterpreted and like given the wrong labels. But I mean, do you feel the same way? Like, I mean, games. The way I put it is, it's not that I make games; it's that I cannot not make games.
Yes. It's funny because my husband is also a game designer, and people always ask us, they're like, don't you get tired of designing and talking about design and talking about games to each other? And we're like, no, we thrive on this. We love
Yeah.
it.
I get tired because I don't get to do it often enough. That's why I do the podcast stuff. Is because I mean, the trouble is, because I'm the CEO type, I have to have the senior role. The amount of time that you actually get to spend head down into the design problems, it diminishes. So for me, the joy is thinking about the why of games, and then what could you do next? I mean, I have probably 1,000 different games I could make, probably 10 of which might be good. But each one has some nuance in it. And every time I look at a problem, I bring that library with me and try and
Right.
work out what's going on. So, I mean, let's talk about, because when you've been Big Fish and Graham, and I think you had a little bit of time at Spyfrox, and obviously you're Rare at the moment. There are differences there. So I remember the Big Fish guys were very focused on the sort of casual kind of experience. Graham, I knew the Graham guys quite well. Cam in particular was a really interesting guy to chat to around the way that they did things like merge. Was it merge? I can't remember which merge it was. One of the merge games they did.
Dragons.
I think
Merge
maybe
Magic
Merge
or Merge
Dragons.
Dragons?
I think it was the one before Merge Dragons, but there was the one I'm thinking of was their first attempt at kind of a merging game, which wasn't as successful as Merge Dragon, which was obviously explosive. But some of the lessons they learned from doing that process was really fascinating. But again, I don't think of that as casual. Because if you think about like some of the Big Fish hidden object stuff, there's a different pace to that. There's a different intentional nature to that. Am I making any sense?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean it's weird because we design for a specific audience in mind, but that can always be tweaked. Like
Mm.
it's not the contents of the game, like you could easily make that game for a different audience.
Yeah. Oh, and people
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
Because I think there's, like I say, I think we've already talked about making a game for an audience, but I think within that bit you mentioned about how to feel. I'll give you an example. I was on stage with the one of the guys from Midway, and they do Polytopia the other day, and I happen to be a super fanboy of Polytopia. And I was talking to him from my experience of playing the game, because I'm a solo player, because I see it as a therapeutic process, and I was using that as an analogy to the rate in which they do their updates, which is very lightweight, very. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is a game that's quite complicated. Those of you who don't know Battle of Polytopia, what are you doing with your lives? Go play it. It is fantastic. But there are nuances, and obviously adding a new army type has a whole bunch behind the scenes in terms of gameplay balance, movement, art. Even though the art is very simple, there's still an art element, and even narrative. There is a game narrative arc, even though it's never in your face. But the point is that they do that update maybe once every 6 months, maybe a bit less often. Whereas in most games, if you didn't do it every month, you're dead in the water. So the reason I mention this game, though, particularly, is that I play that game in this kind of like lethargic, relaxing, meditative way. Other people are playing that game in an intense, hard, strategic, functional, efficient way. And so understanding what you're trying to create, and we talk about Merge Dragons. I want to reveal. I'm trying to work out my optimized strategy so that I can the most efficiently unlock the next new dragon. And I think this mindset, this journey that we're trying to take our players on, if we don't understand their motivation, the psychological kind of benefits that they're getting from it, we're not understanding the reward system.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I mean, like there's always a different way. Like I'm going on a tangent when we talk
Go for
about
it. That's what we're here for.
like everyone can have ideas. Like I'm not afraid of someone stealing my idea because the implementation of it like can be completely different off of the same idea.
10,000%. Yeah.
So it's sort of like who like understanding what experience you want the player to feel like experience basically informs your design. And it's sort of like when I play Dark Souls, my husband plays Dark Souls, like an action-based game,
Yep.
and for me, it's really special because no other game does this for me. It's I get to play carefully, like poke an enemy, back off, and then learn their pattern, and like it's very kind of forgiving to me. Like I can learn the pattern at my own pace, and like the checkpoints are easy as long as I can get back to my souls. I can get it,
What?
and so I know that's bizarre, right? It's bizarre.
Honestly, I don't. I wish I had that patience in me. I joke about Dark Souls that I basically wish there was a save, a IAP to have a save point. And I don't mean this would make the game better or worse. I just mean, for me,
Right.
the use of an in-app purchase is an intentional punishment. It's a real world punishment. So I wouldn't do it all the time, but I would still have spent about £1,000.
Yeah.
Because there's no way, as someone who's slightly dyspraxic, don't get me wrong, I don't want to over egg it, but I can't follow the patterns perfectly. And some of those monsters, if you don't follow the patterns perfectly, you're dead. That's it. And so I can't finish Dark Souls. I mean, I'm incapable of it. Well, I also don't have the patience. But if you give me an ad or a pound to spend an IAP on, I'd have happily given them another £1,000 because I wanted to. I love the concept. I love the mechanics. I just can't repeat them. But anyway, your style of playing, that's really interesting that you think you can tap, step back, tap, step. And it's the same thing for all of those games. So, for example, with Elden Ring, are you finding the same mechanic works?
Yes, Elden Ring does decent for me. It's funny though because Bloodborne doesn't. Because Bloodborne has that mechanic where if you keep attacking the creature once you've lost life, you can recover some. I don't know the term. Some of your life bar.
Yeah.
And I'm not an aggressive player, so that's like the opposite for me.
Gotcha.
Bloodborne was much harder for me. I still love it. But it was much harder for me.
But again, I think that another example of a designer's job is: do you follow the established pattern of the control interface, or do you throw it out the window and start again? And obviously, what I'm describing, partly because of my dyspraxia, and therefore never quite hitting the button I'm intending, or to the pattern I'm intending. As a result, if you're deviating from the default way the controller is intended to work, not intended, has historically been used by designers, if you don't follow the same language that has been established, I will spend forever getting it wrong. So it exacerbates my problems playing. So I think we've got a massive challenge. Whereas, why do I admire Dark Souls? Well, because they decided to make their own control schema that happens to make more sense with multi arm behavior, if that makes sense. Obviously give me VR controllers any day, but that's not an option, sadly. But I mean, I keep saying the word, am I making sense? But I think these are sort of problems that you deal with in your design job, or what's the equivalent of these problems that you're dealing with?
Oh, so many problems with controls.
Yeah.
So many control problems. That's also, bringing it back, something that we initially, like if you're aspiring designer, that's not something you typically think is design, like considering the control scheme. But yes, definitely a lot of challenges with that because as designers, we want to innovate on things and change things. And sometimes that's really hard when people have like intuitive controls or like they have things that they've already learned as standard. And then to like push them away from that takes a lot of effort, and you have to make sure that it's really worth it in the end. Or there's like
a lot of people think that a lot of people think that these things are good, but they're also one of the biggest barriers to play. People who are not fully versed, who didn't get classically trained with their SNES or whatever, a device like that is a abhorrent obstacle.
Yes.
So no wonder mobile devices exploded because it's in my pocket anyway, and I use this thing or this thing because they work, and I don't have to interpret which one I use. I just tap the screen, I do the thing, and
when I
yeah,
first used one of the controllers, because I was used to like Nintendo controllers, and then when I got the thumbsticks, I was in a game of Halo with my friends, and I was just like
yeah,
constantly looking up, down, getting shot. Like I couldn't get a like handle of it. So yeah, it
yeah.
absolutely is a barrier, and I
Well,
think
at that time for
yeah.
me, because I'm classical PC Master Race type background. I probably shouldn't use that language anymore because it's all got a bit toxic. But back in the old QuakeNet days, when we were literally doing dial-up modem-based games, there was an absolute law that mouse keyboard was the only way forward. And then Halo comes around, the Xbox comes around, and the Xbox was actually my first console. Actually, that's not quite true. The Atari 2600 was my first console, because I'm old, and I had original stuff. Loved it. There was also a Binatone console that had Pong and a light gun. So we were doing this like shooting kind of things with it in like 1980 something. It's ridiculous. I'm old. I'm so old. Anyway,
I
but
had
the
an Atari
Xbox.
as well, so
Oh, yeah. Well, but
yeah.
yeah. I mean,
But I feel old, so
oh, I'm super old. But I think, yeah, like you say, this just transition is the hard part, and it's hard to convince people that there might be better ways to do things. That's why I love a friend of mine, Robin, does amazing games using non-standard interfaces, and his I forgot his name of the games, but I'm terrible at that. But he has this fantastic. I think it's called Line Wobbler or something like that, which is basically a dungeon, a one-dimensional dungeon. It was a line out of LEDs, and you had different colours, and you had this like basically like a door, like a spring door stopper, as the interface,
wow.
and it feels like you're in a dungeon because of the way things appear, disappear, move up and down the thing, and you get so absorbed in this thing, which is basically a multicolored long, like 20-foot line. I'm exaggerating; it's probably about 10-foot line of LEDs, and it feels incredible. And it just shows that there's more possibilities out there of how we might play games if only we could step away from the kind of norm.
Definitely. I mean, that's why that's why I'm interested in like VR, and I'm interested
Yeah.
in AR, and
Mm.
there's like physical games. So there's a lot of people who are doing theater crossover with games, which
Mm.
is really fun.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of opportunity there. There isn't a lot of people who are, going after that. So I don't think it's progressed as much as, console games, but
Well, this is where people like Imre Jelly, formerly of Bossa, who's doing a bunch of stuff in that space. I can't wait to see what he's up to because he always astounds me what he does. But he's definitely got this massive interest in connecting, theatre and performance with gameplay. Yeah, honestly, folks like him make me feel like I'm a rank amateur, which I am
it's
comparatively. Yeah,
it's so exciting to hear projects like that, though. Like
yeah,
even with VR, there's a lot of people who experience games with heights, and if they're afraid
yeah.
of heights, they can get over that fear. There's so many possibilities.
No, exactly. And actually, we just put a pitch in for a project for an Innovate UK grant based on to make a game from using the microphone to breathe. The reason being is and I've no idea if the grant will go through, but it's a doctor who is a specialist in this area, and breathing therapy at the moment is essentially you get a plastic device that you breathe into. Well, can we do something with a phone where you breathe into the microphone that we interact, some engaging gameplay happens as a result? Because if games are good at something, it's keeping you wanting to play. So if we can find a way to do that, when we can do some interesting things where games can actually do something incredibly meaningful but all we're doing is applying this kind of like pleasure level to some repeatable behavior. But even then, that's just one example. Another example, the guys behind Sea Hero Quest. I don't know if you're aware of that one.
Yes.
Which I mean, those guys are fantastic. I'm a huge fan. But to be able to make a game that allows us to diagnose potential risks of dementia. Again, why am I saying these things? So I'm saying them because I think we underestimate the power of design. I think game design is something we've touched the surface of. And the possibilities of its application wider than just games, I think, is huge. But I don't want to underestimate the joy. We are the single largest form of digital entertainment on the planet. There's a reason why we're the single largest form of entertainment on the planet. And I think our role as designers is to tap into that. So let's kind of pursue. I mean, obviously, I talk too much, but we were talking about kind of your different kinds of roles and the different kinds of design functions that you've needed to do. What have been the kind of key lessons that you've picked up as you've gone from these different roles? What's the sort of, if you had to think about kind of the different audiences, different games you've worked on, are there some fundamentals that you think that other designers, people who wanted to have a game design role, should take forward?
Across all roles, across all the experience.
Well, take it how you like, because I'm thinking you've got different roles with different perspectives. I think there must be some differences in the way that each of these teams have operated that brought you some interesting kind of nugget that you take forward.
Oh, let me think. They're also different. Different. Because mobile design, it was quite a fast development, and it was kind of a live service game, so I could put out content as fast as possible. And I also had data on my side, so there's a lot of experimentation and learning there. Whereas in console development, it's a bit more considered like in terms of what we're putting out, unless it's like live service. But when it comes to like working on a new IP, there's a lot of considerations put there. There's a lot of like how we provide a new experience for players, also like multiplayer stuff. The way people play in a single player game is different than they may play in a multiplayer game, and we have to make those considerations. And it's different between co-op games and PvP games, and it's even wilder when you have both in the same game. So it's been pretty crazy different. But there's one thing that throughout all the roles I've learned is that iteration and experimentation has been really helpful. Not being afraid to kind of test out different ideas, not like be strictly set on one idea. And I really enjoy being adaptive as a designer. I think a lot of people who want to go into design may think they come up with an idea and that's what they want to go with. But there's so many different considerations to make, like the type of player you're making the game for, how you implement it. You may run into lack of resources or technological issues and that sort of thing that you have to work around. And the fun in that is adapting and making it work. It's sort of like you have a paper clip and a stick, and now you have to make
a bridge.
A bridge. And it's really fun if you can get into the mindset. Yeah.
So it's interesting. So I have this kind of like language that I use a lot. I probably bore people with it on here as well. Opinions firmly felt but loosely held.
Yes.
I think, you've got to be able to fight for your idea. But I think at some point you're going to lose the argument, whether you were right or wrong, and you've got to give it up. And that's so hard. It's so hard, especially when you know you're right, and then you sleep on it and you realise you're not for various reasons. I am that guy that finds it very difficult to let loose. As in not let loose my opinion. I'm very good at that, but to give up my my dearly held opinion, I do struggle with. But I have learned that that's necessary. And some of the biggest successes have often come where I've got the right idea. This is the way to solve it. I just cannot convince the other party at all. Just cannot. And there might be lots of different reasons for it. Often it's because they don't think in design terms. I don't mean that in kind of a design people are better. Far from it. It's just that it's sometimes hard to make the leap between the concept and what the thing will be. And often that constraint is the mother of invention.
Yes. So
By the very fact of dealing with that, you would then have to overcome it, and you end up with a better experience.
yes, yes. I have so many things to say about this. And it may be tangents. It may be tangents. So a lot of it is, a lot of design is, I wouldn't say convincing people of your vision or your idea, but like communication. It's sort of
Yeah.
like, this is what the idea is, and this is why it's great. And everyone communicates differently. So
Yeah.
for me, it was like, oh, I'm talking to artists. Let me show you what it could be art-wise. Or like a lot of the engineers I work with are very systematic people. It's like, this is the system. This is why it's great. And a lot of that skill set is like learning how to look at it from their perspective and then winning them over. And then
You say this, but I am the butt of many a joke from Ella, my business partner, when we were trying to make a game based on the Rocky Horror Show, which sadly didn't work out. I was trying to show the concept artist what I wanted the character to be like, and I drew this kind of set of like, this is riffraff. I'm happy to show people stuff like later. I tried to show them the kind of frame I wanted. I drew this scrappy set of triangles and stuff like that. And no sane person would think that anything other than a drunk spider in an inkwell did this thing. And yet, the concept designer we were working with got it and perfectly nailed it as a result. I am absolutely the worst person at drawing, but I love the fact that you seem to. I mean, are you able to do the art stuff to a certain extent yourself then?
I wouldn't say I'm an artist. I love doing art as like a hobby, but I would never.
Do you think it's a necessary? I mean, I've already sold the lead that I don't think it's necessary personally, but do you think is it helpful that you can at least convey imagery and art for somebody else to then take forward?
It's so helpful.
Yeah.
In some ways. I feel like it's kind of helpful that I'm bad at it as well. Because it's sort of like, I can say,
you heard it here first, folks. You've got to be bad at art to be a good designer.
But it's sort of like, hey, look, this is terrible, but maybe you can get some inspiration for it and kind of see where I'm going with it. Whereas, like, if you do it well, it's like, well, what is there left to, like, for me to concept out?
Yeah.
Right?
Where's the interpretation left for the artist?
Yeah.
That's an interesting one, because that raises some questions. Because I'm a fan of using AI as a tool, with the caveats that I think we need to work out what's going on with the copyright, the source material, and all the other stuff that goes with the kind of darker side of the politics involved with it. But I have found it incredibly interesting that I can now, to open up my phone, I can draw something and it can turn my scrappy nonsense into something that doesn't look terrible. Yeah. That to me is magical.
I think it is magical. I mean, not going into like, the ethics of it, but I like using AI as like just experimentation, just as a prompt. It's sort of like, I need someone to give me a prompt, and then I can gain inspiration off of that. Sometimes it's sort of like, give me 2 items and that I can play with, and then I play around with that. So that's how I use it. But I think, it's very.
But I think, again, if I want to make a quick board game, I I haven't done this yet, but it's occurred to me that I could at least get to the stage where I can have the concept art for the board, the concept art for the cards, assuming I have cards, characters, whatever else it might be. I can produce that in ways that I wouldn't have been able to do before. But at the end of the day, there's nothing like sitting there with somebody who actually has creative vision, artistic vision, and has a history of understanding what you're trying to convey emotionally. So when you work with a great concept artist, I think there's a massive difference between that and trying and muck your way through yourself.
It's so different. It's also different when it comes to artists that may not be trained in game development.
Mm.
Like, I've noticed that some artists just naturally pick it up, but some
Yeah.
artists that are seasoned in game development, they know what you're going for. Like,
Yeah.
as a designer, you're like, this is what I want to go for. And they're like, oh, okay, well, these are the considerations that may affect gameplay. And it's like, that's amazing. You already thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. We were working with a team recently, and the direction we went with ended up being completely different than we expected because we weren't showing them just game art. We were showing them all sorts of different sources, and what we've ended up with for the particular art style for that game is completely radically different from what you'd expect from a classical game. It was more like a magazine, more like a kind of artsy kind of magazine. And I think this goes to something you said much earlier on, that actually having multiple sources that are not always just games can be incredibly beneficial and should never be underestimated.
I also think that it's nice to be challenged because
Yeah.
I've had ideas and people have given me challenges with that. Like, oh, I don't think it should be that way. I think it should be this way.
Yeah.
And it's fun to design around that because then you get kind of a hybrid, the best of both. And then you come up with something original. I mean, I feel like that's where new stuff comes from. You're like, okay, like you have two people who are like disagreeing, but they work together to make something new, and that's great. Like,
Yeah. I mean, people often say about the constraint being incredibly important, but I think the blank page can be so limiting in terms of if you were really given $1 million and nothing to constrain you, would the game be better? I think this is why a lot of teams struggle with the second game.
yes.
If you take some of the biggest hit games, even something like Rovio, with the Angry Birds. I knew the team long before they made Angry Birds. In fact, I launched the first proper game that was Angry Birds. Well, sorry, the first proper game that was Rovio, a game called Darkest Sphere, and it was a Java mid-P game. I think it was the second game they made as a team. And Angry Birds itself, I think, was the 51st game. Depends on who you asked at the time, which one it was, but 51st, I think, was the right one. So imagine they've gone through all those games and they've done all that experience and whatever, and it's their last throw of the dice. They're struggling as a team. They throw out a thing. It's Angry Birds. It's a cultural phenomenon. But following that is incredibly hard because, yes, you've had all the legacy, but you've had one success, and sustaining and maintaining and growing that success. It's had billions of downloads by now, I'm sure, or at least hundreds of millions anyway. That is a blinding factor. So the fact that team now has no constraints when they were having to make something to survive, they're very different states to be working from. And I think it's not a surprise that whilst they made some great games since, none of them quite made the same thing. I mean, Supercell's probably the exception, but even Supercell, think about the vast number of games they've killed, games that we've never seen. Sorry, I love the fact that the game teams kill games at Supercell rather than the games being killed, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So anyway, I find it. I think we forget that there are so many factors that are going into making successful game designs.
Absolutely.
I genuinely think it's probably the hardest job in the world. Okay, I'm over egging it, but it is an incredibly difficult creative job because we're going to have an opinion about how the game should flow for the core mechanic. But if we don't take into account a sense of purpose and progression, we're not going to have a success. If we don't take into account the cultural connection, so the lifestyle fit of the game, the collaboratives, the competitive elements, how do people who play the game get watched by other people? That's a massively important part of game design now. And then on top of that, we've got to explain it all to programmers to make the game work. We've got to make sure it stores properly. We've got to make sure we get the right art. We've got to make sure we got the right, marketing processes, social media. So many factors, so many skill sets, linguistics, physics, storytelling, even for games that don't even seem to have a story. We have to make that all work, and at the end of the day, it's down to the subjective decision of the audience at the time it's released.
Yes, there's so many factors. It's it's crazy. There's like there was one part where a game I was working on, we had to consider what the game looked like and if it fit what was being marketed. Because like if we market the game and people take the gameplay as what's being seen in marketing, we have to make sure that matches. Otherwise, they'll be disappointed once they come in.
Absolutely, absolutely right. I could carry on talking about this subject forever, as I already have done, and I want to hear more from you. So we'll have to do another one of these. But we are running out of time, so I'm gonna leave it. Turn the tables on you again. So there are going to be people out there who want to design games. They may be looking for a career as a designer. They may be looking to just make their own indie title. Do you want to tell what's sort of one thing that you would give? Maybe two or three things, but what's the sort of one thing you think that people should take away from this conversation? What should they, if they want to be that designer role, how would you frame what they should be doing about it?
Oh, that's tough. There's so many things. I mean, I come back to just try to gain as many perspectives and think about as many different perspectives as you can and experiment a lot. I really like experimenting a lot and getting hands-on, and like it doesn't have to be an engine. It can be a paper prototype. But seeing how people interact with it and learning from that and then moving forward with that.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one thing I talk about is I'm trying to encourage people when I'm asked, I basically say, come up with 100 ideas. Just a sentence or two, that's it. Get rid of 50% of them.
Yes.
So you kind of just take the 50 best. Then do a one-pager for 10 of those. And then which one of those 10s you're going to make a trailer. So basically you just use a game engine or whatever to make, using some off-the-shelf Unity asset or whatever it is, freebies, nothing's that costs any money, but just make enough gameplay to show what it would feel like and turn it into a trailer. And you want to do at least 2 games, but with 2 variants of the mechanics and 2 variants of the art. And then spend 150 quid each variant. So you've got 4 variants, 150 quid on each variant over 3 days. And at the end of the day, make the one that has the lowest cost per click. Because you've gone through the process of exploring ideas and working out judgmentally which ones instinctively aren't good enough. You've then gone and you made one pages, you maybe even paper prototype stuff, you've then made a trailer of things, you've actually thought through what the experience for the player is going to be like, and only then make it. Because I'd rather spend more time, experimenting, learning, trying, rejecting, than wasting money making the one game that I think I want to make and finding out that no one cares.
Yes.
But by the way, I still try and make the one game I want to make all the time, which is,
I
don't be me. Listen to me. Don't be like me.
I think that's fine as a hobby. I mean, if it's your guilty pleasure, like who's gonna tell you no?
Exactly. Nothing wrong with doing the guilty pleasure. And let's face it, how many great games have come out of the guilty pleasure?
Yeah.
But let's not forget how many survivor stories there are. So many people try. I remember. I won't go into details of the particular game, but there's a particular set of games that I've seen where the designers were massively successful, building essentially a variant of a game that had existed years before, and they got so used to that, therefore meant they were right rather than being lucky. And it's not, and that's fine. I mean, they were right. They got the pot. Great, fantastic for them. But it's the people who try to follow them and do the same thing that they did, not realizing that 99% of them are going to go and just throw their money down the toilet.
Yeah.
And that breaks my heart. That breaks my heart, because you end up with lots of people who leave the industry disillusioned, when actually, like you said, it's experiment, it's try, it's let's use a scientific method to prove that our experiments aren't just our opinion. Anyway, love the art of design. Let's spend more time learning and teaching it, and let's get more people doing it. Nina, thank you very much for chatting with me. It's been an absolute pleasure. We need to do more conversations about design. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And this has been your Game Dev Local podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then like, subscribe, share, tell other people, comment. In fact, actually, why not come and join us on our Discord? There's a whole community of people who are fascinated by the business and the process and the experimentation of making games. And if you didn't like it, then obviously come and tell us, and we'll try and improve it. But it's been a great pleasure chatting to Nina. It's been a great pleasure chatting to you all. And join us next time, and we'll talk more about the business of making games. Thank you very much.